Hello there, and welcome back to another exciting edition of Pandemic Radio. On this week's episode, we'll be discussing pollution in all of its various forms and the human health impacts of pollution. So sit back, relax, pour yourself a nice cold LaCroix. I'm going with mango. Mm-mm. And let's settle in for a little pollution and health 101. Let's start with the troubling statistic that is the burden of health attributable to pollution. It has been shown that pollution in its various forms has been linked to approximately 16% of all premature deaths worldwide. Pollution is a significant contributor to mortality worldwide. So when I think of pollution, or if I, let's say, ask, what comes to mind when I say pollution? What would you say? Think about that for a second. I'm just going to take a sip of my LaCroix. Refreshing. So, pollution, I would say, is typically thought of in terms of that stuff that comes out of car exhaust or the stuff that billows out of smokestacks. It's the smog in the air in Los Angeles. That would be air pollution, right? So that's what I typically think of when I think pollution, right? But what I want to talk about today is, in addition to air pollution, the other various forms that impact human health, including a few that maybe you don't think of very often. So let's start by defining what pollution is. This is a definition that I found and I like from the Lancet Commission on Pollution. Imagine that. So basically, what that means is this is a consortium or a group of global health scientists and experts who have come together and basically decided here's what we're going to define pollution being. They said, quote, pollution is the unwanted, often dangerous material that is introduced into the Earth's environment as a result of human activity that threatens human health and that harms ecosystems. So let's unpack this. First keyword, unwanted. These are often byproducts of industrial activities, the pollutants that come out of your car. These are certainly not a desired part of the automobile process. They are unwanted, typically dangerous for not only human health, but also the health of ecosystems. And what's hopefully clear to us now at this point in the semester is that human health is closely tied to the health of ecosystems. You really cannot have good human health in any sort of sustainable way without healthy functioning ecosystems. So, pollution can impact human health directly or more indirectly if it harms the ecosystems that human health depends on. So, like I said, air pollution is a commonly thought of form of pollution, and we're certainly going to talk about that. We're even going to start with it. But we're also going to talk about water pollution, chemical pollution, and then a few others that I think are interesting and deserve some attention as well. Maybe you haven't really thought of before in terms of human health impacts of pollution, but we're going to talk about noise and light pollution. So again, pollution statistics are jarring, they're alarming, and they reinforce the really important role that pollution plays in human health. So in 2015 alone, it's estimated that 9 million people died as a result of pollution that did not need to die. In other words, you take away pollution from the environment, these 9 million people are still alive. That's 3 times more than AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria combined. That's 15 times more than all wars and other forms of violence in that year globally. So again, pollution is a significant cause of mortality. Non-communicable diseases account for most of the burden of disease from pollution. So if you think about all the different health impacts that pollution has, about 3/4 of those health impacts can be classified as non-communicable diseases. So non-communicable diseases are things like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, aka COPD, lung cancer, heart disease, stroke, and other cardiovascular diseases. Pollution is intricately linked to poverty and countries undergoing the early stages of industrial development, and as such, is not equally distributed geographically. Like many things that we study in this class, there are patterns, clusters, and non random trends to the underlying uh, determinants of health. So in this map, we see areas in this choropleth map. We see areas that are darker shades of red, are have higher rates of mortality attributed to pollution. So typically, we see the greatest burden of disease associated with pollution in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and parts of Western Pacific. Pollution and poverty are closely linked. 92% of all pollution related mortality in the world occurs in low income or middle income countries. In the most severely affected countries, those countries where the impact to human health from pollution is greatest, pollution related disease contributes to more than 25% of deaths. So imagine living in a country where 1 out of every 4 people who die because of pollution. It is disproportionately affecting the poor and vulnerable members of the global community. It also greatly impacts children. Children are particularly sensitive and susceptible to the effects of pollution. When you look at the various age categories and the mortality within each age category, you see obviously a very significant spike in mortality associated with pollution as people get older, with those over the age of 80 very sensitive to the effects of particularly air pollution. But if you look down at the other end, you see children under 5 and particularly children under 1 are especially susceptible compared to teenage years, 20s, 30s. So there's this susceptibility that children and very, very young children have to air pollution that's worth keeping in mind. So let's start with air pollution. Probably the most common form in that comes to mind. At least that's how it is for me. When I close my eyes and think, well, what does pollution mean to me? I'm probably thinking about dirty air. So we can talk about air pollution in two ways. So we can talk about the types of air pollution, and there are two. The pollution that occurs in the air within households, and then basically outside air or ambient air pollution. And that the actual physical pollutants that are in the air can be broken down into either fine particulates and ozone. So, fine particulates are typically measured with this metric called PM2.5 or sometimes PM10. PM2.5 stands for particulate matter at less than 2.5 microns in diameter. So, this is combustion particles from industrial activities, organic compounds, metals, and other forms of pollutants that form tiny, tiny little particles that are so tiny you can see in relation to the size of a human hair, you can see how tiny these little things are. I would say that PM 2.5 is the most common measure of air pollution because it's also one of the most dangerous, and I'll explain in a sec why that is. But essentially, it's so dangerous because these harmful particles are so small that when inhaled, they can travel deep into your lungs and deep into your lung tissue, and that increases your risk of disease and problems substantially. So you have this kind of natural kind of cleaning mechanism. So if something is you know big enough, it'll kind of get trapped, like in your nasal cavity or in the kind of parts of your lungs where it won't get too deep. But PM 2.5 is dangerous because it's so small; it can travel really deep into your lung tissue, and that's problematic because your lung tissue is quite sensitive. So the other form is this stuff called ozone, and you may be thinking to yourself, "Well, Doctor Bales, I thought a hole in the ozone layer is bad. We got to save the ozone layer." Well, yeah, that's because it's the good ozone. Well, what's good ozone? Good ozone is this natural sunscreen that exists high up in the atmosphere, in the stratosphere, that basically forms this protective layer that shields us from harmful UV radiation. If we were to get rid of this layer, life on Earth as we know it would cease to exist because everything would get fried up from UV radiation. When you take ozone that is closer to the ground, when it's not up in the stratosphere protecting us from the UV radiation, we're now talking about ozone that is bad for human health. So ozone is the main component of smog, and if you've ever visited Southern California or lived down there, you know what smog is. I lived in Los Angeles for a few years, and I became quite familiar with smog. When I first arrived, I looked out over the beautiful valley with the palm trees, and I thought, it's kind of hazy out. I wonder if there's a fire somewhere. No, that was just smog. So, smog is basically ozone that is at the ground level. It is harmful for humans to breathe, but it also damages plants and ecosystems. So, ozone is a combination of basically these pollutants from industrial activities, gasoline vapors, chemical solvents, um, and other forms of basically oxides of nitrogen, as well as volatile organic compounds. So basically, these kind of nasty compounds that, when combined with heat and sunlight, produce ground level ozone. So, ground level ozone is the quote unquote bad ozone. Ground level ozone is not directly emitted from the tailpipe in your car or from those factory smokestacks, but is created again by this chemical reaction between these chemicals and the presence of heat and sunlight. So think about where ground level ozone, let's say in California, might be particularly bad. Thinking about it? Go on, keep thinking. Just gonna have another sip of my LaCroix. That's refreshing. Okay, ready? How about Los Angeles, the city of angels? Ground level ozone is particularly bad in this part of our little slice of heaven known as California because of a few different things. So, when you think of Los Angeles, you probably think of traffic and cars. Everybody drives, and the freeways are, a trafficy mess. If you've been to the area, there are these really beautiful mountain ranges to the east, and there's obviously the Pacific Ocean to the west. And when the winds blow from the Pacific Ocean inland, they basically pick up all of these chemical pollutants and the mountains kind of trap everything in the Los Angeles area. And Southern California is essentially a kind of arid coastal desert, so there's plenty of sun and plenty of heat. This is a perfect recipe for ground level ozone. So this is a serious air pollutant in Southern California, in particular, for those reasons. So air pollution does not respect political boundaries. It is not going to stop at passport control. Pull out its air pollution passport and say, "Oh, geez, that picture's so embarrassing. I wish I could retake it. Why was I squinting like that?" No, it's not going to do that because it transcends borders. Here's a good example. We on the western coast of the United States in California experience this phenomenon. For example, when we breathe in ground level ozone, about 5% of that comes from industrial activities in China and other parts of that region. And it's basically kind of blown across the ocean and arrives at our um, back door, and is a kind of good example, if not kind of scary example, of how pollution is really a global environmental health problem. So pollutants that are produced in one part of the world can have an impact on another part of the world. So this really is not a kind of, this country versus that country. It's really this kind of global issue. Indoor air pollution or household air pollution is a significant cause of death. Approximately 4.3 million deaths per year uh, can be linked to household air pollution. And this disproportionately affects women and children. Household air pollution is generated by the incomplete combustion, typically of solid fuels like wood, charcoal, uh, or in some parts of the world, they burn dung in the home for cooking and heating. It is thought that 2.8 billion with a B, people burn solid fuels like this indoors. So this, if you've ever traveled abroad, if you've ever been in I've done a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa, and this is a pretty typical scene. This is a typical scene in many parts of the world. This is how people cook. This is how they get heat. This is a significant contributor to indoor or household air pollution, and obviously, something like this has profound implications for human health. So, household air pollution in children can cause acute respiratory infections. Children are more susceptible to infections because their immune systems are still developing. So, when they're breathing this stuff in, they're more susceptible to acute respiratory infections. Adults are more susceptible to chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, that's COPD, stroke, and heart disease. And these have all been linked to exposure to indoor household air pollution. Landscape fires. This is something we're maybe a little more familiar with up here in Northern California. This is another form of ambient air pollution, a significant form. And landscape fires or wildfires, mainly associated with deforestation and land clearing, results in over 300,000 premature deaths worldwide. So, just because of these fires, over 300,000 people die each year. This is a really jarring example that occurred in 2015, and this was an event known as the Killer Haze. This is basically the result of large-scale deforestation, a type of deforestation known as slash and burn. So when you want to replace a forest with farmland because you want livestock and cattle because that's more profitable, how do you get rid of all the trees? Well, the quickest way is just to burn it down. And this happened on a grand scale in 2015 and resulted in the death of over 100,000 people just from this type of land clearing. So that's a pretty stark and disturbing example of how serious of an issue this can be. So what we're seeing in Northern California is an interesting example of how ambient or outdoor air pollution, the dynamics are changing. So landscape fires have historically been forest fires. So they've been, Smokey the Bear out in the mountains and the forests, further away from humans, more in rural areas. And when the smoke is produced, it's typically coming from burnt trees and wood. More and more, we're seeing images like this to the right where these large scale fires are coming into contact with human settlements. And in addition to trees and bushes getting burned, you're also having things like houses and cars also getting burned. All of that's turning into smoke in the air that is breathed. And this actually has a name. This basically these regions where people have built their communities near forest areas or areas that are susceptible to wildfires, and they're called the wildland urban interface. And they're defined as areas where homes are built near or among lands that are prone to wildfire. Okay, so this picture to the right here would be considered a wildland urban interface. And you can see geographically, you can actually map these. And in Marin County, the areas in red here are considered or classified as wildland urban interfaces. And it explains why a lot of these Northern California fires are becoming so devastating is because these wildland urban interfaces are actually growing because human populations are expanding more into these areas. And the result is really at this point still a big unknown for human health. So we know the fine particulate matter that is produced from forest fires. We pretty much know what that kind of looks like and what that consists of. But what we're seeing more and more is scenes like this, where in addition to trees again getting burned, you're seeing things like cars and houses and refrigerators and everything else getting burnt up and turned into that fine particulate matter known as PM 2.5 going deep into your lungs. And we don't know what that's actually going to be doing to us. We can guess it's probably not going to be something good, but we really don't know yet what the long term health implications of that are. So I've posted this video to the website, and I encourage you guys to watch it. I think it does a good job of explaining some of the research efforts and the kind of current state of understanding of this problem. So, if you're interested in becoming an environmental health professional and getting a good paycheck to kind of work on this kind of stuff, there's going to be demand for that kind of a position in the future because these wildland urban fires are obviously a big problem now and are projected to continue to be a big problem. So we need people trained in the skill set that you guys are getting trained in to, understand and study this problem. So ground level ozone, let's come back to that because here in California and in many parts of the world, it's another form of significant uh, you know uh, health impact. So again, ground level ozone is formed from a chemical reaction between oxides of nitrogen and methane, and VOCs, volatile organic compounds. Ozone air pollution, so that's the ground level harmful ozone, the bad ozone, kills approximately 150,000 people per year. What is interesting to note here is that it also can actually reduce crop productivity and forest growth. It can block or interfere vegetation's ability to take up carbon dioxide. So you guys all remember from, um, high school biology that plants take up carbon dioxide to as part of the photosynthesis process. Uh, when you have a lot of ground level ozone, it actually can interfere with that process. And again, what is bad for ecosystems is bad for human health. Okay. Um, it is a result of this chemical reaction that occurs by mixing heat and sunlight. And so there are varying levels of ground level ozone that occur throughout the day. So geographically, it is unevenly distributed, but it's also unevenly distributed day to day. So ground level ozone pollution risk is actually highest in the middle of the day when the sun is brightest, all the factories are burning, cars are churning, and the sun is highest in the sky. Okay, that's a little bit about air pollution. I want to go on to water pollution now. We can talk about water pollution in two ways: water pollution as a result of unsafe water sources, and water pollution as a result of inadequate sanitation. So, water pollution and the impact on human health typically comes from acute and chronic gastrointestinal diseases, typically in the form of diarrheal diseases. Uh, this accounts for 70% of all deaths that are attributed to water pollution come in this form. But it also can come in the form of typhoid fever uh, or other types of infections, such as lower respiratory tract infections. But a vast majority of the human health impacts of water pollution come in the form of gastrointestinal disease. Again, children are particularly susceptible to this form of pollution. Children younger than 5 years of age are most susceptible to unsafe sanitation and unsafe water sources. This is the geographic distribution of mortality attributable to water pollution. And you see again, there is a non-random distribution. If where you lived had no impact on death from water pollution, this map would be one color, right? There are obviously differences in geographically where you live and your risk. So, sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Southeast Asia, again, are most susceptible to this form of pollution. What is hopeful and some positive here in this kind of otherwise rather gloomy lecture is that we are seeing improvements worldwide. So between 1990 and 2015, 2.6 billion with a B, people gained access to improved drinking water sources. Okay, so the well water or lake water that people draw their water for cooking and drinking and living from has improved. 2.1 billion people gained access to improved sanitation. Okay, so water treatment facilities and things like that. The number of children specifically dying from diarrheal diseases decreased by about 60%. And that's really this pretty massive number when you think of it. That's going from about 1.5 million deaths in 1990 to about 0.6 million deaths in 2012. So we've seen this big decrease in the burden of disease, but it still remains a pretty significant problem. Okay, so chemical pollution in the form of soil pollution, heavy metal contamination, is another important consideration here, and probably the most important one is lead, or at least most studied. So lead is, and we're starting to see a theme here develop here, right? Particularly potent toxicity wise for children. When children are exposed to lead, it leads to neurodevelopmental toxicity, which can contribute to cognitive impairment, which leads to children having shortened attention span, increased risk of attention deficit or hyperactivity disorder. And studies have shown that exposure to lead as children can lead to increased risk of antisocial and criminal behavior later in life. This is particularly troubling because the effects from lead exposure when you're a child can persist across your entire lifespan and ultimately result in decreased school performance, increased risk of drug abuse and incarceration, and decreased economic productivity. So, lead exposure, in other words, might be a contributor to poverty. And what we've seen earlier is that poverty and pollution go closely together. So lead is dangerous among children, even at tiny, tiny little levels. Even at very small blood concentrations, lead can cause problems in children. The World Health Organization has said that, quote, there is no known level of lead exposure that is considered safe. Children should not be exposed to any lead. It's also harmful for adults. Not as much so, but it can contribute to cardiovascular diseases like hypertension, stroke, and other forms of cardiovascular disease. So it's not good. We have seen a drastic reduction in lead exposure in the United States, at least, because you've probably seen this when you've gone to the gas station when it says unleaded. Uh, lead used to be a component in gasoline, and there was a public health campaign to remove it. There were bans put in place on the use of lead in gas, on paint in buildings, on plumbing, and this led to a really big, substantial reduction in lead exposure. Um, in fact, worldwide, lead is now basically been removed from gasoline. In over 175 countries, there is no more lead in gasoline. So another kind of public health win. Okay, so let's wrap it up with talking about a few of the maybe lesser considered forms of pollution that impact human health, and that is noise and light pollution. So I think these are actually pretty interesting and rather exciting areas of research because really not much is known about this, and we're just, I think, scratching the surface of the impacts of this kind of pollution. So exposure to prolonged or excessive noise has been shown to cause a range of health problems, um, and let's kind of dig into that a little bit. So evidence has shown, studies have been conducted and published that show that when people are continuously exposed to noise, this basically sets off a stress response in your body. And this really has to do with kind of our evolutionary history. When we were early humans and hunter gatherers, we we developed this kind of fight or flight response to danger. You guys have probably heard of the fight or flight response. When you're in danger, your adrenaline levels spike and your blood rushes to your muscles so you can run away or fight. It's a stress response. It's cortisol levels spiking, and it's a good thing in small short bursts because it can get you out of trouble, like about to be eaten by a lion or a tiger or something. If you hear that loud roar, you spike your stress response and you're prepared to run away and survive. Um, we did not develop this response during the age of like garbage trucks and honking horns and other kind of sounds of the city. So essentially, what constant exposure to noise pollution does, is set off basically a stress response like you're in danger, but at kind of continuous levels. So it's not natural for us to hear or be exposed to like traffic noise all the time. And so just even without us kind of thinking about it, we're having this kind of stress response that, long term has has implications for our health, which can lead to like cardiovascular diseases and other health problems. So the World Health Organization, interestingly, has ranked traffic noise as the number two public health threat behind air pollution. Stuck in traffic, hearing horns, the jackhammers, the leaf blowers in your neighborhood, all of this has an impact on your health, and you probably didn't really think about that very much, but it has to do with that kind of stress response that naturally we evolved with, that fight or flight cortisol response. It's basically being continuously triggered by these sounds. So again, we kind of uh, developed early on, in these, environments that made life hard, but they were relatively quiet, right? There were no traffic noises, there were no honking horns or car alarms. It was just sort of peaceful sounds of nature, right? The only loud noises were noises that were dangerous: thunder and tigers roaring, and maybe uh, other groups of people that you're fighting with. All of these produce noises. Okay, so bad stuff made noise, and everything else was basically just peaceful and quiet. So this fight or flight response developed, and cortisol was released, adrenaline and other stress hormones, which contribute to this fight or flight response, like I said, and really kind of biologically explains why noise can be impactful for our health. So, in addition to like the heart disease that I talked about, respiratory disorders, and even tumor development and cancers can and have been attributed to constant exposure to stress hormones as a result of noise exposure. So, these kind of fight or flight responses that are triggered kind of continually can actually have a restructuring, basically, effect on the brain. I'll post this link to the website, but it actually basically shows you a kind of risk map of noise in the United States. So here's another interesting one: underwater noise pollution. So you're thinking, well, I'm not a dolphin, Dr. Bales. Why do I care about underwater noise pollution? Well, I know you're not a dolphin, but remember, dolphins are part of ecosystems. And us humans, we depend on ecosystems for our health, right? There's that whole ecosystem services thing we've talked about. But just like traffic and city noise and other forms of noise pollution have increased, so have underwater noise pollution issues. And the number of gigantic cargo ships worldwide have increased. Things like, oil refinery, or like, oil drilling, sonar testing from military operations. All of this basically creates this kind of noise underwater. And this has pretty profound implications. And I'll, again, post this video to the website for marine ecosystem health. And again, marine ecosystem health is a human health issue when we run it through the framework of ecosystem services. So, by changing the environment through underwater noise pollution, what ecosystem services might be impacted that results in changes to human health? So, could there be an effect on marine life from noise pollution underwater that lead to ultimately less fish? and less fish means less nutrition for human groups that depend on fish. So there is a connection if we can use the ecosystem services framework um, to understand why this is important for human health. Light pollution is another source of pollution that has grown in recent years. So you see in the 1950s, this map shows you where in the country light pollution was most intense. You see in the major cities, Southern California, the Bay Area, parts of the Pacific Northwest, and then obviously New York and parts of the East Coast, Chicago. Um, as you can see, just in 50 or so years, you see this dramatic increase in light pollution. And by 2025, you basically see the entire eastern side of the United States is heavily inundated with light pollution, as well as basically all of California. Very few actually dark sky places left in the country. And there was this interesting thing that happened. In 1994, there was a large earthquake that knocked out all of the power in Los Angeles. So there basically light pollution was reduced to zero. And 911 calls started coming in from residents who were frightened and basically reporting, quote, giant silvery clouds in the sky. So they were thinking, oh my gosh, what is this like, weird thing up in the sky? Is it aliens? Is it what's going on? Well, it was the Milky Way that a lot of people were seeing for the first time. If you've ever been camping or been out to like Big Sur or any kind of dark sky area, this is what the night sky looks like actually. It's just we don't ever see it because light pollution blocks it. It drowns out all that stellar light. So what citizens or residents of LA were seeing for the first time, many of them was the night sky because we become so accustomed to light polluted skies where we can barely see the stars. And another short video that I encourage you guys to watch on the site. So this light pollution, again, why we're talking about this, impacts human health. Um, some ways that are more kind of obvious and some that are more obscure. And again, we can use things like the ecosystem services framework, specifically the kind of cultural services, recreation, activities such as stargazing. I myself am a dabbler in night photography. I enjoy taking photos of the Milky Way in the night sky and like meteor showers and things like that. That brings me peace of mind and happiness. That to me is an ecosystem service that a healthy night sky brings. And when that's blocked, that can be impactful. But also, um, more and more studies are coming out that show that this kind of exposure to this kind of pollution, light pollution, can increase the risk of certain types of cancers. It can disrupt your circadian clock and lead to depression, insomnia, and other diseases. This is largely an unknown field, and I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of what this particular kind of pollution can and is doing to our health. So if you're looking for future employment opportunities, and you want to get paid to do cool stuff, I would recommend maybe investigating what are the human health impacts of light pollution, for example, because we know that it's only going to get more substantial. That this form of pollution is growing. We really don't know what this is going to be doing to our health, either directly, for example, by messing with our circadian rhythms, our sleep patterns, or like indirectly. So, how is it going to be like impacting plant and animal communities that might ultimately impact our health? So, using the ecosystem services framework to understand that. So, fun little Snapple fact: the top three countries least affected by light pollution. So these are the countries with the darkest night skies: Chad, Central African Republic, and Madagascar. 75% of their population lives under pristine dark sky conditions. So they see those vivid Milky Way skies every night. Snapple fact 2: the most light polluted country in the world, Singapore. This entire population lives under skies that are so bright that their eyes can no longer fully adapt to night vision. So the residents there, when they go out at night, their eyes don't fully adapt um, to night vision because it's so dark, or sorry, it's so light out. So another kind of fun Snapple fact to take with you to your next fancy cocktail party. You're welcome. Okay, so that is pollution in a nutshell. We can spend years discussing pollution. This is a quick and dirty, just kind of overview of pollution. Hopefully, it got you thinking about some of the different types of pollution, more than just like air and water. It's a serious public health threat. In some ways, we know quite a bit about it, but in other ways, we're just scratching the surface. So it's this really kind of interesting, um, exciting, I think, field of research in the future. It's only going to become more of an issue, and it needs environmental health professionals to kind of be on the front lines of fighting it. So, hope you guys enjoyed this. Hope you enjoy kind of looking through the background material. I tried to put some fun, interesting stuff out there. Um, enjoy your last GIS lab. We're again looking at the possible effects of pollution on a global pandemic. And we'll see you guys next time. This has been Pandemic Radio. Your humble host, Dr. Bales, signing off.